Welcome to the Period Story Podcast, the podcast where we get behind some of the myths and misconceptions about periods. We chat with women about their period story, their first period, their journey ever since, and we open up a conversation to help break taboos and stigmas around menstruation. I'm your host, Lanice Brothers. I'm a yoga teacher and registered nutritionist specializing in women's health, hormones, and the menstrual cycle. I'm also the author of You Can Have a Better Period, the book Publishers Weekly calls an empowering debut, an informative, refreshing take on women's health. It's available from Amazon, Bookshop, and anywhere else you purchase books. Welcome to today's guest. I had a fantastic conversation with Natasha Richardson, the medical herbalist and women's health expert on today's show. I'm so excited for you to hear this one. After having struggled with debilitating period pain for years, Natasha discovered how natural remedies could help, but was disappointed by how difficult they were to acquire. As a result, she launched her own line of products called Forage Botanicals. Natasha is an advocate for embodiment and normalising menstruation, birth, and menopause. Inspired by her feminist proclivities, she has researched the history of how products surrounding women's health have affected how we relate to our bodies and the inner sexist beliefs we hold against ourselves and each other. Enjoy today's show. Thank you so much for coming onto the show, Natasha. Let's get into the first question that I always ask my guests, which is, tell me the story of your very first period.
So I have a really no memory of it at all. And I think that this must be hopefully telling that it wasn't problematic. But I do remember, I do have a light bulb memory. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. It means you can remember exactly where you were in space and time when something happened. I can remember myself standing in the playground in primary school, and somebody had just told me from, there's girls magazines that have period information in, because kids send messages in being something's happening, is this normal?
Yeah.
they had one of those, which was obviously for teenagers. So I'm guessing some older sibling had it in the house, and it had been brought into primary school, which was for under 10-year-olds. And somebody said, "Oh my God, it says here that you're going to bleed between your legs." And I was like, "What?" I was like, how could that be? I just remember standing in the playground, looking down at my crotch and thinking, where is it going to come from? And can it be true?
How old were you when, all of this was happening?
So I would have been potentially just as young as 6 or 7.
So 6 or 7, you kind of have, I'm just thinking about my son. He kind of has a basic understanding of these things. And, when you want to ask, he'll ask things like, what's sex? And then I don't give him a detailed explanation, but when he's had enough, he'll just turn to a different topic. When was that kind of you're questioning it, and then did you got this information from a friend, and then did you go and speak to your parents or sibling about what you had heard in school?
Yeah, so I think I kept that to myself, because I remember kind of trying to really process this concept in the playground that day. But then I do remember that my mum gave me a period education book. And I think I'm pretty sure she gave us that before they did anything, before we had our talk in school, because I remember us kind of as girls all crowding around it in the playground and being oh my God, we're going to get boobs. We're going to what is all happening? And it was this kind of secretive, gossipy kind of thing. And we were getting, our education through this book that my mum had provided for us. And so I must have talked to her about it in order for that to have happened. And then I remember us getting the talk, which I think was more, it was definitely about sex, but then we split up into male and female in order to learn about the menstruation portion, I believe. And I always like have envisaged that like what were the boys being taught? And somebody then later told me, oh, that's when they learn investment banking. And I was like, it all makes sense now.
And how old were you when you were getting this kind of sex ed chat at school?
So then we would have been like probably 9, I think. And they were aware that some people probably would have already started their periods, and they because they literally would know who had started, because those poor souls who had started really early, they had like this kind of backup plan for those people where they could come to the staff room and say that they need some sanitary pads or whatever and get some. So I don't know what that experience must have been like for those people who started earlier than everybody else.
Oh my gosh. I imagine being 8 or 9 years old and having to go to the staff room to say and like knocking on the door and the staff
and everyone looking around, and then you like trying to whisper to a teacher, hopefully not a man.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Oh, that's like horrible.
Yeah, it sounds like traumatizingly bad, but
And so you don't remember your first period, but if you think back to the early years of having a period, what was that experience like for you?
Well, I remember being eager for it to happen. I remember my other friends got them before I did, and I was very like excited to get it. I did kind of see it as a marker of becoming a woman, and I'm not sure if I had started to really get geekishly knowledgeable about paganism and Wicca at that time. That was definitely a big influence for me during my teen years. And I was like so aware of like this concept of there being like 3 distinct phases of womanhood. And I was a maiden and I was about to enter into being a menstruating person. Yeah. And I was super excited about it actually, as a marker of me growing up, I guess.
When you say so for listeners who aren't aware, so 3 phases of womanhood in the kind of pagan world, can you describe those?
Yeah, so you have maiden, mother, and crone in the pagan world, and it kind of denotes like a maiden can be anybody who hasn't had a child, biologically speaking, but a mother could be somebody who just is motherly, and that, you know, those aunties that you might have that are like very motherly, but they don't actually have children of their own, like those kind of people in your life. That could be the mother phase for somebody as well. You didn't necessarily have to have a child. And then a crone would be somebody who had presumably gone through menopause, but it's also like bigger. It's more like metaphorical as well for becoming more wise, which I think is hilarious now that I'm like older and I look at, you know, the older generation in my life. I feel like you actually like reach a point of like maximum maturity, and then you just regress through like teenagehood and then into like being an absolute child again.
That's interesting. I feel like if I think about the older women,
like my mum is.
Go ahead. Your mum is
my sort of teen rebellion again right now, and her mum is like it's like amazing and everything's great, and it's like, oh, this breakfast is amazing. She's got terrible dementia. She can't remember really why she's there, or she can't remember anything bad in her life. She just like lives from the moment and is just loving it.
So go back to what you were saying about how paganism influenced your experience of having a period during your teenage years.
Yeah, so I think that it gave me a concept of divine feminine and masculine, and that everybody's a mix of both. And because it has this whole like goddess worship as part of its main functionality, or doctrination, maybe that's the right word, it I'm assuming that it gave me the basis of what would then become my feminist politics, because it saw femininity in a positive light. And I don't know, I guess I'd seen a bit of that elsewhere, but with girl power and stuff like that, that was in the 90s, isn't it? And I remember getting really into 1960s history. I don't know why, but I read like loads about Haight-Ashbury. I think it must have been the music that my mum was listening to. And then I sort of segued into that from there. So I was kind of like living this bizarre like fantasy world where I was a witch pagan in the 1960s. That was my make-believe world that I lived in as a teenager.
I mean, the 60s, definitely, like in San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, very exciting time. So to be a pagan feminist witch then would have been quite incredible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, so this is the kind of the kind of more theory around what having a period meant to you. And what about in practice? Like what was the practical experience of having a period like during your teenage years?
It was like a secret club of like growing up that the girls were a part of that the boys weren't, and that it was like you didn't really talk about it much, but people knew. And then I don't remember thinking at the time like I'm being secretive because it's shameful. I was like just thinking, yeah, like it was part of being a secret club. I thought it was cool.
You're definitely not like the first person I've heard this from, like having a bit of a secret and like the kind of thrill of having that secret. And then was it something with your like girlfriends you would whisper about? What did how did that secret look like in practice?
Yeah, so I think that it would be something that we could talk about in female circles comfortably, but that we didn't talk about in front of other people. So yeah, it ends up becoming like a sort of bonding experience for a particular gender. And I liked that. And I like we had a period talk in secondary school, which was much more oriented towards like understanding the variety of products that were available to us. And it still wasn't sustainable at all. It was just very much like there are lots of different sizes of tampons and lots of different sizes and shapes of pads. That was kind of it. Somehow managed to fill an hour just talking about that. I don't know what that was about. And then at the end we got a bag, like it was like, I think it was like pink metallic jiffy bag style envelope kind of thing with pads and tampons and stuff in. And the boys didn't know what we had been taught about that day, but we all emerged with like these secretive yet snazzy bags of stuff, which they were just like hypnotized by. They desperately wanted to know what's in it. And everyone as a collective just knew, like, no, we're not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you what's in here. It's our stuff.
What's interesting about having this experience of having a period feel like being a part of a secret club is that there's almost two ways that this can go. It could be a secret that feels cool and interesting and exciting. And then it could also be a secret that there's some shame to it. And you feel like that shame stops you from talking about it and learning more. Was that your experience at all? Or was it more like the cool side?
It felt cool at the time. In hindsight, I've looked back on it and been like, oh my goodness, yeah, we were doing all of that because of this like hundreds of years of shame that's been like smashed into our heads. But I think that it gets not diluted, and not necessarily transformed, but changed as the different generation goes through that experience of keeping something secret. I'd like to know like what it was like for maybe my mum's generation of being taught about it. My understanding is there was no secret club. It was just like, get on with it. And you learn the bare minimum and just get by kind of thing. So I feel like maybe our generation made it cool because we've been told to feel positively about being girls in the first place. And we're in, I think of everything now in terms of like what my research as a historian has like taught me. So maybe like contextually, like living in a time where we're being told girls can do anything, they can take over the world, they can do whatever they want, they can be a Spice Girl if they really want to. So maybe that's why we turned that kind of secretive stuff and made it into a cool club.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, it's better than it being like shamed and you just feel like something's wrong with you or having a period.
Yeah. And it came as such a big surprise to me to discover that people in my age group had that experience.
Yeah. And then thinking about the practical experience of having a period, something that you have said is that you struggled with debilitating period pain. When did your period start to become painful?
So it wasn't until I went to university that started to happen. And so it was quite surprising because it just seemed to like come out of nowhere. And it took me ages to like really take on board that was even what was happening, because it would be once a month. And I think that, I don't know why, but I just like ignored it for the longest time, probably as much as like a year. And then because I was learning herbal medicine at the time, someone was like, that's not normal though, Natasha. And I was like, yeah, I guess like it wasn't even normal for me. And I'm still not picking up on it as something that's worth doing anything about. Then but then it did get really bad. Like, I think it was just ignorable for quite some time. And I was like, yeah, it's fine. But I remember I worked part-time in a shop at the time in St Pancras Station. And St Pancras Station, all the shops have glass fronts on them. So it's like you don't have a wall to the front of your shop in a way. And everybody can see in. You're very much like a goldfish in a bowl. And I remember getting really bad period pain. Painkillers weren't helping. And my boss looks over at me and she's like, Natasha, you okay? And I was like, yeah, I'm fine. She was like, because you look pretty green. I was like, what? And I looked in the mirror and I looked kind of grey green. And I was like really just holding it together. And as soon as she said that, I was like, well, now you mention it. I actually have really bad period pain today and I'm struggling. And it turns out that she had period problems herself of a different ilk. And so I felt like very like I could be open. And it was nice working there because with a beauty store, almost everybody was girls. So it was very easy to talk about those kind of things. And I just like had to crouch down behind the till point so no one could see me. And just like, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't keep a conversation. I couldn't serve anybody. Like, I was completely debilitated. And my boss was like, I think you better go home. You're not any use to me here. And I was like, yeah, probably not. But I don't know if I'm going to make it. I like remember just really slowly and in a very heavy haze getting on the train and like sleeping to my train stop. And when I got there, I got off the train and felt nearly completely fine again. And I was like, damn it, I shouldn't have left work. I should have just stayed at work. And that was the nature of my pain. It was like very extreme, but really short-lived. And it was, in a way, the shortness of it made it more awkward than the actual pain did.
So when you say short, are we talking like a day? Are we talking a few hours?
Like hours. So when I went to the doctor about it, eventually I was like, yeah, I get really bad pain, but it only lasts a few hours and then it can be completely gone. And they were like, well, I guess it doesn't sound that bad enough for us to like look into it seriously. And I was like, okay. And they were like, just keep an eye on it and see if it gets worse, then come back to us. Maybe we'll do some tests and stuff. And I was like, all right then. And they offered me some painkillers, which I didn't think I wanted, or it didn't work. They offered me the contraceptive pill, which I didn't want to take. And but the shortness of it meant that I felt super awkward about explaining to people, like, I can't do something that day because I may or may not have debilitating pain at some point during the event. And it was really just awkward to explain that it could be that bad for such a short frame of time. And often as a side effect of me being in pain, I would need to rush to the loo at some point, which made me feel really self-conscious about where I was going to be whilst experiencing the pain. Am I going to be near a toilet? Is it going to be a toilet that I'd be happy to use? Is it going to be, it was just like horrible. And then that became a problem in itself, that I would start to forebode my period. And I was like looking forwards in time, thinking, when is it going to be? What shall I block out of my diary? How much should I block out of my diary? I started blocking out a 3-day period, time frame, where I'd put, don't book anything on these days because you're likely that's going to be your period. And it was just like living like that for ages. It's like, and I think like by that point other people knew, and I was moving in herbal circles, and everyone was like, you should definitely treat this. And I'm like, oh, okay, if I have to.
That is so interesting that, like, you're studying herbal medicine, and like, okay, I'm like thinking about my experience studying nutrition, and I do think that nutritionists, you go into study nutritionists, you get so like almost like some people can get really like almost obsessed with what they're putting in their body and the symptoms that they're experiencing. Not everyone, but I do know that can be a common experience. But it's interesting that you had this, this pain, and you were kind of like, not acknowledging it in that, you had to acknowledge it when it happened, but it took someone to say in your course to say to you, like, you need to deal with this. Where do you think that came from? Why do you think that it took you so long to actually do something about it?
Like in hindsight, I can see like exactly why. And it was just that I thought it was kind of normal, and that's what everyone was going through. And like everyone gets period pain. So this is probably just that period pain that people have been talking about all this time that I just hadn't had. And I'd just been one of the lucky ones that didn't have it, and now I have it, and this is what everyone's going through. And I just didn't think anything of it for ages. And we weren't taught menstruation as part of our herbal course when we were doing anatomy and physiology, because our anatomy and physiology was being taught by the same department who were teaching the nurses. And nurses, at least at Lincoln University, didn't learn anything about gynecology because it seemed to be a specialist subject.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So we didn't learn about it till later that year in our first year, because they had to add it on as additional subject at the end so that we didn't miss out on that information altogether. And I just remember being like, when are we going to learn about gynecology? When are we going to learn about menstrual cycles? Because I was like really interested in them by then. And I just remember the anatomy and physiology nurses just being like, oh no, we don't learn about that. That's for specialists. That's for gynecologists. We can't learn about that. It's like, what? I was livid. I mean, I was like full-blown early 20s, feminist, righteous white woman, just like, what? We can't not learn about periods.
Did that change anything at all on the course, or like did they add it in earlier eventually and not as a specialist subject?
So I think, I'm not entirely sure, that I imagine that they definitely would have had it, that they knew we were going to have to learn it as a specialist thing right from the get-go, because they've been running the course for a few years that way already. At least I think so. It's hard to remember. But anywho, because it's a holistic practice, that was definitely always going to be a part of what we were going to learn. I think that it had to happen right at the end of the course because it was the only time that we had available, I think.
Right.
So it did feel a bit like, oh, and now we're going to do a little bit extra about some stuff that you didn't learn. And it was sort of like, it felt a bit like optional add-ons by that point, because it wasn't part of the core like modules. But obviously, like, everybody was just like, this is so crucial. And the herbalists teaching it were like, yeah, of course it is. Yeah, that's when we learned. We did one on breastfeeding, one on menopause, and one on menstruation. And we were just like, we could have done a whole module on this. They're like, yeah, we know.
Oh my gosh.
And then I think we did a lot more in second year and third year from that point. Yeah, it became a big thing for us.
And then, so when you learned about the kind of anatomy and physiology of menstruation, did it change your perspective on your period pain?
It might have done, but I honestly don't recall it these years are like a bit of a funny blur to me. You know, it just feels like you were a different person, doesn't it? Like, sometimes, like, you've lived 3 or 4 different lives by the time you're 30. It's weird.
Yeah, no, I definitely relate to that. How is your relationship with your period now?
So now it's like positive, but it's far different from before I had kids. Like, before I had my son, I was like, it was like a religious practice almost. Like, this week I shall not be doing any social things because I'm in my premenstrual phase. Like, I think that was the kind of dialogue, at least, that I had in my head. I don't think I was that exhibitory about it. And now my periods are like so unproblematic. They like barely hurt. I hardly get any PMS. There was a point where I was getting that really bad pain that also the week before I would get really tired to the point where I couldn't do anything. I couldn't go out and stuff. And that time frame, I also started to get social anxiety. I couldn't go out, or I could go out, but not without anxiety. So it became, that period pain was wrapped up in a whole really dysfunctional part of my overall well-being. And then as that all got better, it all gets better together, is what I'm trying to say. Then I tried to get pregnant and got pregnant. And after that, it just has gone. It's all gone.
So after you gave birth, your periods just kind of stopped being painful. And then the anxiety, the premenstrual anxiety just kind of went away.
Yeah, because I knew one of the key things that actually I was given quite late on in all of that, I found that the herbs and stuff could get rid of it nearly completely. And I was really vigilant about taking them for a long time. Then I stopped and it started to creep back in. And I went to a doctor who said, why don't you try mefenamic acid? Nobody had offered me that before. And I was like, well, I guess, yeah, I think I'm at this point where I'd rather try and just take a painkiller for the day than change everything about the way that I live and eat. So I think I tried it and I took one and I was like, holy crap, just completely got rid of my period pain. And as a byproduct of that, knowing that I could take a single pill and it get rid of all my pain for that month, I was like, all right, this is good. And I didn't ever get period pain as bad ever again. And it wasn't because I carried on taking the pill. It's because I knew that I had a pill, if I needed to, that would relieve the pain.
Wow. The MMA, methylmalonic acid, was different kind of mentally in your experience to taking like ibuprofen or paracetamol.
Yeah. It was different. And I think it just had this amazing, wonderful placebo effect for me where it just relieved that. I was taught there's primary and secondary pain. And primary pain is the pain you feel, and secondary pain is the pain that you create by feeling anxious about the real pain. And I think that it just like totally got rid of the secondary pain for me because I knew that I could do something about the primary if I really needed to. And I never got period pain as bad ever again.
That's really interesting that you bring up this, primary and secondary pain, because I see this a lot in my clinic. There's the pain, but then there's also the anxiety around the pain and the kind of anxiety that the anticipation of getting your period creates. And I see this where we address the pain, but then the work needs to be done around addressing that anxiety about the pain potentially coming back. So it's interesting that, that one pill completely changed your whole experience.
Yeah, it really did. And that's not to like poo-poo like the incredible like healing that I'd experienced through herbs and stuff. It was just that at that point in time, I was just like it was beyond comprehension to me to do the kind of like legwork that had been involved in me getting the same results a year before that, in a more holistic fashion. Yeah, I think, to an extent, again, with hindsight, I look at it and I think, it was, to an extent, it was a very privileged position for me to be in, a position where I could be that flexible with my time, that I could take time off when I needed it and work when I thought was best. And it was really privileged of me to be able to change my food to something more healthy. Not everybody can do that. So yeah, all of those kind of like things is what led me down the route of wanting to launch my own products to help with these things, so that people didn't have to spend literally years of changing their lifestyle and their diet and because I didn't think really that all of that was entirely necessary for some of the symptoms I was experiencing. I do think it was necessary for that deep healing to occur, though. I think I'm a much better person for having done it, for definite.
So people will be listening to this thinking, well, what can I do? What herbs can I take? What can I do to address my period pain? What would you say to them? Well,
I think the first thing that anybody should do before they even start trying to take stuff is just have a clear record of what the last, few periods have been like, because otherwise when you start taking something, you might not really remember what it was like and be able to pinpoint if it's helping or not. Because one of the trickiest things of a period is that it's once a month. It's hard to remember sometimes what happened last month. So yeah, just like make sure that you keep a record first and foremost, and then introduce something. And if you're going to introduce 5 things at once, then you got to bear in mind that you won't know which one of those 5 things was the one that's doing the good stuff if it starts working. So you'll feel like you have to keep trying all 5 to keep it up. So I try to recommend people just layer in one thing at a time, like literally 1 month at a time. But I know when people are in like severe pain, that's not what you want to do. You don't want to spend a month to figure out something does or doesn't work. You want to do what I like to call the kitchen sink technique, just putting it all in. So I'm I'm fine either way, but my key thing is keep a record of what the experience was like before and after. So and you can start taking things like, you can start working with like our products that we make in our range. They're really there to help with period discomforts, like things that are not being caused by an illness, but that are a sign that maybe your well-being is there are improvements to be made, right? Because it's really like a sliding scale from health to illness, and there's a lot that happens in between, and that's really, there's only like a very finite area at the end of illness where doctors want to get involved, and there's a lot before that where you could be making improvements, and that's really where our product range sits. But having said that, if you have been diagnosed with something like endometriosis or PCOS or whatever, the things that we have in our range will at least alleviate some of the symptoms, and some of them will, like the rest of resilience. Oh my God, everybody could take that because it helps at a really deep level with long-term stress and healing from like PTSD and trauma and the long-term stress that everyone's gone through with the pandemic. So yeah, anybody could take that and probably benefit. And you can look up things online, but it's really a dodgy world out there. I would usually tell people to get a book called Bartram's Encyclopedia of Herbal Medicine, for a book that will tell you what to take for literally like anything you can think of. It's incredible. I use it still like 12 years into my practice. And I wrote a book called Your Period Handbook, which will take you through specifically like herbs for periods and period problems.
So lots of different resources there for people to dig into. And then if they want to check out your products, I'll put all the links in the show notes, but can you just mention the name of the company again?
Yeah, it's Forage Botanicals, as in foraging for botanicals.
Great. So what a lovely name. And you've sent me a few products, which I'm going to check out. I'm about to get my period. So I'm going to use some of the period focused products and see how they work for me. But yeah. I want to just go ask you about some of the research that you do. You do some research around the invention of PMS. And I find that really interesting because speaking to women in my practice and like in the work that I do, it's like they talk about, I'm PMSing. And when I talk to them about how, PMS it's just a collection of different symptoms, and it's not inevitable. You're not automatically going to feel like this right before your period. It's kind of like, it's mind-blowing for some women because there's this kind of cultural programming that we get that, we're supposed to feel like this. And, I'm interested to hear your take on this.
So my concept of PMS is that it is a hypermedicalisation of a perfectly natural phase of someone's menstrual cycle. And it can be problematic, and that's when we tend to refer to it as PMS, but it might not be problematic. And the word premenstrual syndrome in it is a bit of a giveaway, right? Whenever you hear the word syndrome, it just means a collection of symptoms. It doesn't mean they know why it happens. It doesn't mean they know like that there's a particular hormone that's at the bottom of all of it. They don't know what's happening with it. It's just a collection of symptoms. So you could call the way that you feel after a big meal, post-big meal syndrome. Like you can just create syndromes left, right, and center if you want to. They're not, and I think this kind of always blows people's mind, that generally speaking, like the medical terms that we have for illnesses are just a description of the symptoms that you'll experience and not much more. And when it comes to syndromes, like anybody who's got IBS, they'll also know a syndrome is really something where they don't really understand what's called the pathophysiology of it, like the path of illness that it takes in the body. And you got to wonder, how could we not possibly know for something that apparently women have had since the dawn of time? And if you start to go back through history, like, okay, well, when did we start calling it PMS? It's kind of like in the early 21st century. And it's around about the time that we start to drop the word hysteria. And if you look at the two, they look a lot similar. They have a lot of similarities. This like momentary madness and specific to women. And even now, like culturally, we deem it as like a time where we go a little bit crazy. And like a lot of jokes have been made to that ilk. And so, knowing that historically that seems to be a path that we take with women's health to hypermedicalize, I am very cautious around PMDD as well, which I know is such a problematic thing for a lot of people to hear, but I'm very cautious around it. So that's not to say that like I think that it might not exist altogether. I think it definitely exists, but I think that the way that we're framing it as something that should be treated hormonally is probably not. Well, we frame it like it should be treated hormonally, but actually we give antidepressants for it. So I think even the way that we're talking about it is confusing. yeah, I think that we have a lot of work to do with this. It's just like, sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so for listeners who aren't aware, PMDD is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and it's different to quote unquote PMS because it typically starts right after ovulation, where the people who are experiencing it, they have trouble dealing with the rise of progesterone and the second smaller peak of estrogen. And it's interesting that you say that it's people are treating it hormonally and it shouldn't be treated hormonally. I could completely agree because, if you look at the research behind PMDD and some of the kind of mechanics of the condition, there's, a lot around serotonin and the link between serotonin and estrogen, but also progesterone and GABA, and the effect that those have on the mood and the energy. And then if you think about the different symptoms of PMDD, you then wonder, well, you can see why people are saying, well, take an antidepressant. I've been told by some clients that their doctors have told them that they should only take their antidepressant in the second half of their cycle, which doesn't make sense to me.
No. So my experience with people who have PMDD has been, I haven't met a single person who has PMDD who's had a happy life. Not a single one. Everybody I've spoken to has been like, oh, and by the way, I was like traumatized as a child, or oh, my mother died 5 years ago and I blame myself. Or like everybody has some sort of ridiculously massive, traumatizing, horrible experience that they've been living with for years. And they're like, but I don't think my PMDD is related to that. And I'm like, come on.
I think with PMDD, though, it can be hard to see the wood for the trees because, that shift after ovulation where we expect, because of progesterone, to feel quite calm and balanced. And, you get told that you're supposed to feel like that, and then you don't. And then you're trying to you're like, grabbing onto a buoy in the middle of a stormy ocean, trying to figure out what's going on. And then you get your period, and then all of a sudden you feel better again.
Yes. That sudden switching on and off, that kind of seems to be the experience of PMDD. I feel like PMDD is what PMS should have been all along, in a way. So the strengths of PMDD is that it's much more specific. We have a much more finite range of symptoms that are associated with it, which means that only a very small proportion of the population experiences that. Whereas with PMS, the list of symptoms is horrendously long. It's like hundreds. It's ridiculous. And it becomes so generalized that it's like literally every person who's had a period will have had that at some point. So yeah, I think we really totally missed the point with PMS. And so now I just try and reframe it that don't think of it as PMS, think of it as it's just premenstrual phase and that we all go through. And it's a time where you naturally, anything that happens is going to be magnified. So if you're already stressed, it's going to be more. If you're already anxious, it's going to be more. If you're already depressed, it's going to be more. And with PMDD, it's like that times 1,000,000, and it seems to go from 0 to 1,000,000 overnight. And I can totally see why, if that's what you're experiencing, that you'd be like, it's got to be my hormones.
Yeah, it's what you're saying is so interesting, and I think we need to have more kind of really clear conversations about the distinction between the two. Really breaking down this myth of PMS, but also being really clear that PMDD is something different, and there is a trauma element to it that isn't necessarily spoken about as much, because I've seen this as well. My clients with PMDD, there's a lot of trauma there, and my clients typically do acknowledge it. But again, it's hard to see the wood for the trees when you're just trying to deal with all of these different things, and also just trying to live your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I always say, like, I can work with somebody with PMDD herbally in terms of trying to help take the edge off that experience. Like, maybe they are also quite sensitive to the normal changes of hormones. Like, if they get a hormone test and they come back and it's all normal, there's always the possibility that you're hypersensitive to the hormones that are at a normal level. So you can work with people for that. But I always say, like, more than likely, you're going to also need some sort of like talking therapy to run alongside this to help with any kind of like underlying trauma that needs support, ongoing support,
Yeah. There's a lot of value in just being able to have someone really objective to talk to, who won't judge you, who will just listen. And because I think with a lot of people with trauma, especially long-term trauma, they're just holding so much in, and also there's a lot that just hasn't been dealt with, and they don't know where to start. And just even starting, acknowledging that you need to start is a really big step.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so PMS is like a whole different thing that I just think we should just like bin it, basically, and talk about it completely differently. We say, I've had a really bad premenstrual phase.
Yeah.
This month.
Completely agree. So there's a lot of really interesting insights there for people listening who to think about PMS differently. It might be countercultural for you. It might be kind of like something you've never heard before, but I really encourage you to take it on. And when you do come to that time right before your period, with the week, the 7-10 days, have a really good look at what you're experiencing, and see if it really is an exacerbation of something you're already experiencing, where you're even feeling even more stress, as Natasha says. If someone is listening to this and thinking, I really want to get in touch with Natasha, I really want to work with her, how can they contact you? What do you have coming up?
So I have been working on a 6-month program with people, a small group of just 6 people for the last 6 months. And that's coming to an end. And because I'm about to finish my master's, I'm probably not going to run it again until January. But that's something you could be joining the mailing list for updates on when that comes about. But I have a team of 2 herbalists, one of which is about to go on maternity leave. So one herbalist, and she's fully booked till September. But you can, by all means, book in a free chat with her in September if you have something that you think you actually need a bit extra support with. They do one-to-one treatment plans with people. Whereas you can always come and like just ask me a question. I am actually the person running the Instagram account. So you can just send a DM on there at Forage Botanicals and I will answer. And you can also send me emails to natasha@foragebotanicals.co.uk and I'll answer questions there too. So although I don't have any, one-to-one tutorial type things coming up from myself, there's always Joe who's there to take patients as well.
Okay, brilliant. So if listeners will leave this conversation with one thing, what would you want them to take away?
To start recording their symptoms, like start writing down when your last period was, start writing down how long your period is, and then put it down every day how your mood, your stress and sleep is as an absolute bare minimum, and start charting that based on the first day of your period being day 1 of your cycle and moving along till the next period, starting another chart then. That would be like my number one thing, is just absolute basic charting is such a necessity. And the research has shown that just charting will get rid of, will alleviate some of the symptoms, because you can see that it's monthly, and that brings you relief.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. I hadn't heard that. So there's a kind of psychosomatic element of knowing that, oh, actually, it's not all in my head, that this is actually happening to me.
Yeah. And like, it makes you feel like, aware that it is definitely happening, but also that it, knowing that it's monthly brings people relief that it's not like part of some sort of hideous disease that they just is lurking.
Well, wow. Okay. Amazing. So at the very minimum, start charting, tracking your cycles, understanding what's happening to you, spotting patterns, and that in of itself might be helpful. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been wonderful speaking to you. I've learned a lot. I hope the listeners have learned a lot too. All the links to contact you will be in the show notes.
Great. And I can't wait to hear how you get on with the products.
Yes, I'll let you know.
Fab. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be on your show today. It's been great.
For more inspiring conversations, head over to periodstorypod.com, where we have so many more for you to peruse. If you want help with your menstrual or hormone health, email me on hello@eatlovemove.com to set up a free 30-minute hormone health review. If you like today's show, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Tag us, come say hi, and send in your requests for who you'd like to see on the show on Instagram and Twitter on @periodstorypod, or email us at hello@periodstorypod.com. I'm Lenise Brothers, and you've been listening to Period Story. Thank you so much for listening.